Good evening, or good morning, depending on where this finds you. I never really know whose night it is when I start one of these, and I've come to like that about it. I'm glad you're here. Tonight we're going to do something a little different from an ordinary hour of listening. We're going to slow all the way down and stay with one single structure for the next 2 hours. No moving on to the next subject, no changing the scene, just you and me and one great quiet figure standing in a harbor for as long as it takes you to drift off. So if you haven't already, let the room go dark now. Turn the phone face down on the table beside you. There is nothing in what follows that you need to hold on to, nothing you'll be tested on in the morning. If you'd like, tell me in the comments where in the world you're listening from tonight and what the hour happens to be there. I like knowing, in a small way, who's out there in the dark with me. Now let's begin. She stands at the edge of a harbor, her copper gone the color of an old coin left too long out in the rain, one arm lifted higher than anything else along that whole stretch of water. Every vessel that has ever come in past her, from the smallest tug to the largest liner, has looked up and seen more or less the same thing. A woman's face turned out toward the sea, a fold of robe caught as if mid-fall, a torch held up against whatever the sky happens to be doing that particular afternoon. Almost none of the people leaning on those rails, coats pulled tight against the wind coming off the water, ever stop to ask themselves what is actually holding her there. It's a fair thing to leave unasked. Copper alone could never do it. Copper hammered thin enough to shape into a sleeve or a shoulder has no more strength by itself than the skin stretched over a drum. Something else is inside her, something unseen, unphotographed, carrying the whole weight of that shape upright against a wind that has never once, in all the years she stood there, agreed to leave her entirely alone. That is what I want to sit with tonight. Not the face everyone already carries around in their head, the Statue of Liberty, but the frame hidden inside her that almost nobody standing on a ferry ever thinks to wonder about. What is it exactly that keeps her standing, and how did anyone in that particular century work out how to build it at all? If your eyes are already starting to close, that's exactly where they should be. You don't need to follow every beam and strut I'm going to describe over the next 2 hours. You can let the shapes of it drift past you the way the harbor itself would drift past a tired passenger who's given up trying to read the guidebook and is just watching the water go by. All I'll ask is that you picture it with me now and then, what it would feel like to actually stand beneath her, to feel the size of her stretching up over your head the way a bridge feels enormous from the deck of a small boat passing underneath it, and to wonder, the way hardly anyone bothers to, what exactly is keeping all that hammered copper from folding in on itself the first time a real storm comes through. For most of the time she has stood in that harbor, that question has gone mostly unasked, mostly because the answer to it sits behind a locked service door that most visitors never even notice, up a narrow spiral stair that climbs through the inside of her that almost nobody is permitted to climb anymore. From the promenade, from the ferry deck, from the observation windows in her crown, you see skin. You see the seams where copper sheet meets copper sheet, hammered so thin in places that if you held a section of it up to a lamp in a dark room, light would pass straight through, the way it passes through a leaf. What you do not see, and what almost nobody who has ever photographed her has thought to ask about, is the iron reasoning underneath that skin, the ribs, the straps, the great central mast rising up through her core like the trunk of a tree with a whole-grown woman's shape draped loosely over its branches. That mast and the iron skeleton branching from it is the part of her nobody buys a postcard of, and yet without it she would have collapsed under her own copper within the first hard winter, folding down into the harbor the way a tent folds when its poles give out. It should not have been possible, actually, to build a standing woman that tall out of hammered copper at all. That was the first problem anyone serious about the project had to sit with, long before a single sheet of metal was cut. A shape that size, made of a material that thin, wants very badly to bend, to buckle, to tear itself loose from whatever is holding it in place, especially somewhere as exposed to wind and salt as the mouth of a harbor. Solving that problem, working out what invisible thing could go inside a copper woman to keep her upright for longer than any of the men involved would live to see, is most of what tonight's story actually is. Everything else, the politics, the money, the crossing of an ocean in pieces, all of it exists in service of that one quiet structural puzzle. How do you hold a hollow copper giant up against the wind and keep her standing there without anyone outside ever seeing how you did it? Before any of that could be worked out, though, somebody had to dream her up in the first place, had to decide, against most people's better judgment, that a standing woman of that size was something worth building at all. And that part of the story starts not in New York Harbor, but in a workshop in Paris, with a sculptor who had never in his career built anything of a modest size, and apparently had no interest in starting now. But who was it exactly, who first looked at an empty harbor and decided it needed a woman standing in it taller than anything else on the horizon? His name was Frédéric Auguste Bartholdi, and if you had passed him on a Paris street in the years he was dreaming her up, you would probably not have picked him out as a man about to spend the better part of 2 decades on a single work. By most accounts, he was solidly built, dark-eyed, carrying himself with the slightly restless energy of someone who found ordinary conversation a bit slow going. A man who, according to those who knew him, preferred to be sketching or arguing about proportion to almost anything else you could put in front of him. He had trained as a painter before turning to sculpture, and he never entirely lost the painter's habit of thinking in terms of silhouette, of how a shape would read from a distance, which turns out to matter enormously when the shape in question is meant to be seen from the deck of an incoming ship rather than across a drawing room table. What set him apart from most sculptors of his generation, and what makes him the right person to begin tonight's story with, was a fairly specific and, by the standards of his profession, slightly unusual appetite. He liked things enormous, not simply large in the ordinary sense that any public monument is large, but colossal, built at a scale that made viewers feel physically small standing near them, the way you feel small standing at the base of a cliff rather than at the base of an ordinary building. You can trace that appetite back, if you like, to a trip he took as a young man to Egypt, where he stood in front of monuments that had already been ancient when the pyramids themselves were still being talked about as recent additions to the landscape. Vast stone figures seated at the edge of the desert, worn smooth by centuries of wind, that had clearly been built not merely to be seen, but to be felt, to make whoever stood at their feet understand something about scale and permanence without a single word being spoken. Bartholdi came home from that trip with an idea lodged somewhere he couldn't quite shake it loose from, that a truly great work didn't just decorate a landscape, it altered how a person felt standing inside that landscape, the way a mountain does or a cathedral does, simply by being larger than a human body was ever built to be. He would spend years afterward looking for a harbor, a city, a threshold of some kind, where a similarly colossal figure might stand and do the same thing, make whoever arrived by ship feel, for just a moment, the particular smallness that comes from looking up at something built far beyond ordinary human proportion. There is nothing you need to remember about any of this, not the dates, not the details of his training. Just let it settle, the way a story settles when you're not trying to hold on to it, because the shape of the man matters more here than the facts of his biography. What matters is the appetite. Bartholdi wanted, quite specifically, to build something too big for a single glance to take in, something a viewer would have to tilt their whole head back to see the top of. And for most of his early career, he simply hadn't found the right place, or the right patron, or the right idea to let that appetite loose on a scale that matched it. He was not, it's worth saying plainly, working alone in his own head the whole time, dreaming in a vacuum with no one to answer to. Around him, in the workshops and drawing rooms of Paris, there was a whole current of people who spent their evenings arguing about liberty the way other men argued about horses or wine. Men who had watched republics rise and fall in their own lifetimes, who had seen a monarchy return after an empire and an empire return after a republic, and who had grown weary, in a way that is hard for anyone born into a settled country to fully understand, of governments that seemed to come apart every decade or two. Among that circle, sculpture was not considered a decoration for its own sake. A statue, to these men, was an argument you could walk around and look at from every angle, a way of saying something about a form of government without having to say it directly to a censor's face. Bartholdi moved easily among them, sketching at their dinners, listening more than he talked. And it was in exactly this kind of room, over exactly this kind of long evening, that the appetite he had carried home from Egypt finally found a subject large enough to justify it. It did not arrive, if the accounts are to be believed, as a sudden vision. It arrived slowly, the way most real ideas do, passed back and forth across a table for years before anyone thought to draw it. There was talk of friendship between two republics, one old and unsteady, one young and still finding its footing across an ocean. There was talk, too, of an anniversary coming due, a marker of years since one of those republics had declared itself free of the other's crown, and of what kind of gift might mark an occasion like that, not the ordinary kind, not a painting or a piece of furniture passed between diplomats, but something a whole nation could be said to have given another, something that would still be standing long after the men shaking hands over it were gone. It's worth letting that sit for a moment, the strangeness of it. A gift too large to wrap, too large even to fully imagine, discussed by candlelight by men who had no particular experience building anything at all, only a shared conviction that liberty deserved a body. You don't need to hold on to any particular name from that room tonight, only the shape of the conversation. A sculptor with an appetite for the colossal, sitting among men who had an idea and no form for it yet, each supplying what the other was missing. Bartholdi left those evenings, according to what survives of his own later account, turning the idea over the way he turned over any new commission, thinking less in terms of politics than in terms of silhouette. What shape, exactly, would read as liberty itself from the deck of an incoming ship? What a stranger arriving from anywhere in the world would need to see in the first few seconds of looking up to understand, without a word of explanation, what kind of country they were sailing into. But an idea discussed over wine in Paris is a long way from a woman of hammered copper standing above a harbour, and between the two lay years of persuasion, funding, and doubt. Years that would take Bartholdi across an ocean himself before he ever cut a single sheet of metal to stand for the first time at the edge of the very water where he imagined she might someday stand. To understand why that idea took hold at all, you have to picture the two countries as they stood in those years, not as the old allies of a revolution fought when neither yet had its modern shape, but as two republics each nursing a wound of its own making. One had torn itself apart along a line no map had drawn until the fighting made it real, and was now left to work out, town by town, cemetery by cemetery, what putting itself back together actually meant. The other had watched an empire collapse in defeat and had been handed almost by default a republic it was not yet sure it wanted, eyed sideways by monarchists who thought the whole experiment would fail again as it once had. Between these two unsteady nations there grew something that was not a treaty and was never signed by any minister. A current of feeling passed back and forth like letters between friends who had each come through something difficult and wanted the other to know they had come out the far side still upright. It surfaces in the record we still have, not as policy but as talk around dinner tables, in the kind of rooms where men who had never worn a uniform in either war spoke of the other country the way you might speak of a relation who had survived a bad fever, with relief, with a strange proprietary pride, and with the growing sense that something ought to be built to mark it. It was at exactly such a table, at a country house outside Paris where academics and lawyers and old veterans of one cause or another gathered for an evening, that the idea first appears in the letters and memoirs that survive. A monument raised by the two peoples together, timed to land on the 100th year since the American colonies had declared themselves free of a distant king. You have to imagine the room a little to feel why the idea had weight. Candlelight, wine going round, the kind of conversation that drifts, unplanned, towards something someone in the room will later claim as the moment it began, though moments like that are rarely as clean as memory makes them. Among the men at or near that table was Edouard de la Boulaye, a legal scholar with a long, patient devotion to the American constitutional experiment, a man who had spent years writing about the United States the way some scholars write about a country they have never visited but feel they understand better than the people who live there. It was La Boulay's circle drawing in the young sculptor Frédéric Auguste Bartholdi that turned a toast into a plan, and a plan slowly. into a shape. You do not have to hold on to any of these names to follow what happens next. They matter only because they were the hands the idea passed through on its way to becoming something with weight and a shadow. What matters more is the shape the idea took almost immediately. Not a plaque, not an obelisk, not the kind of monument you walk past without lifting your head, but a figure, a woman, robed, holding something aloft, standing not in a garden or a square, but at the very door of a harbor, so that anyone arriving by ship from anywhere in the world would see her before they saw the city behind her. Bartholdi had already been turning shapes like this over in his mind for other purposes, other patrons, other harbors on the other side of the world that never came to anything. And when the Franco-American idea reached him, it seems to have met a design that was already halfway waiting for a home. If your eyes are already drifting as you listen to this, that is exactly the pace this story is meant to be told at. None of this needs to be remembered, only felt, the way you might feel the outline of a large room in the dark without needing to know exactly where the furniture is. But an idea agreed to over wine, however sincerely felt, is a long way from a standing woman of hammered copper, and the distance between the two was not going to be closed by sculptors and legal scholars alone, however devoted. Somewhere in that distance, quietly, almost incidentally at first, there needed to be another kind of person entirely, not someone who could imagine a face, a robe, a raised arm holding a torch against the sky, but someone who could tell you, in numbers rather than feeling, whether such a thing would still be standing after its first winter storm. So where, in a France still finding its feet after an empire and a war, would anyone go looking for a person who could answer a question like that? The answer, waiting in Paris, though almost no one at Laboulet's dinner tables would have known it yet, was a firm on the Rue de Chazelle doing quiet, methodical work in a different material and a different register altogether. The design and construction of iron railway bridges, viaducts, and the kind of unglamorous structural engineering that keeps trains from ending up in ravines. The firm belonged to a man named Gustave Eiffel, and if you had walked into his drafting rooms in those years, before his name meant a tower and meant Paris itself to half the world, you would have found a workplace that looked almost monastic in its order. Long tables, ruled paper, drawings pinned in rows, and a controlled quiet broken only by the scratch of pens doing calculations that had to come out right the first time, because a bridge does not forgive a mistake the way a painting or a poem might. Eiffel himself was, by every account that survives from those who worked closely with him, a meticulous man, careful almost to the point of severity, someone who trusted a column of figures the way other men trusted their own eyesight. He had already built a reputation on iron spans across French rivers and gorges, structures that had to hold their shape not through mass and weight, the old way of stone, but through the careful geometry of trusses and braces distributing a load along paths a person walking across could never see. He was known too for a certain restlessness of ambition, a man who did not seem content to have solved one kind of problem and would go looking, sooner or later, for a harder one. But the man whose name belongs beside Eiffel's in this particular story, and whose fingerprints are on the actual mathematics that would eventually let a woman of copper stand upright in a harbor, was younger, quieter in the historical record, and easy to miss if you are only looking for the famous name. Maurice Koechlin was Swiss-born, trained as a structural engineer, and had joined Eiffel's firm as one of its draftsmen and calculators. The kind of position where a young man with a gift for seeing forces move through a shape could do enormous, largely unrecorded work under someone else's name on the finished drawings. You would not have noticed him if you had walked those drafting rooms yourself, not at first. He was one face among several bent-over rulers and slide rules, one more coat hung by the door at the end of a long day of figures. And yet it was Koechlin, more than almost anyone else eventually credited with the statue's success, who would spend long private hours turning Bartholdi's sculptural vision into something that could be described in terms of stress, of load, of a skeleton hidden entirely from view beneath a skin no one would ever see the inside of. Because that, in the end, was the actual problem waiting at the far side of all that Franco-American goodwill, and it was a problem no sculptor, however gifted, had the training to solve alone. Bartholdi could imagine the folds of a robe, the tilt of a face turned slightly toward the sea, the angle of a raised arm holding something up against the weather. He had, by every account, an almost obsessive feel for the outer form the monument needed to take, testing scale after scale in clay and plaster until the proportions felt right to his eye. What he could not do, what no one trained purely as a sculptor could be expected to do, was tell you what would happen inside all that copper when the wind off the harbor came looking for a way to push it over. A statue on a mantelpiece can be shaped by feeling alone. A statue built to stand taller than anything else on a low island in open water, facing weather with nothing to shelter it, is no longer only a question of what looks right to the eye. It becomes a question of forces, traveling downward through a structure that has to be there, invisible, holding the beautiful, visible part of it up. This is the quiet turn the story takes now, and there is nothing urgent in it, nothing you need to sit up for, only the slow recognition settling over Bartholdi and everyone around him that the vision they had already fallen in love with had no way yet of standing on its own. You could describe it as a kind of gap opening beneath a design that otherwise looked finished. On paper, in Bartholdi's early studies, the figure was whole. The robe fell the way robes fall. The torch caught the light the way a torch should. The face carried the calm the whole project wanted it to carry. But a drawing does not have to resist wind, and a plaster model on a table does not have to survive its own weight multiplied by however many times the real thing would eventually be scaled up. Somewhere between the small clay studies Bartholdi kept turning over in his studio and the towering copper figure everyone now pictures without effort when they hear her name, an entire hidden argument had to be settled, an argument about iron, about how much of it, arranged in what pattern, would be needed to carry a skin of hammered metal through decades of storms it would have to face completely alone, out past the edge of the land, with nothing else nearby to break the weather before it reached her. That argument, and the strange, elegant answer it eventually produced, would not be settled at Laboulaye's dinner table. And it would not be settled by Bartholdi's hands alone, however patient and however devoted to the work those hands already were. It would be settled on the Rue de Chazelle, in the quiet, ruled pages of Eiffel's drafting rooms, where a young Swiss engineer named Koechlin was about to spend some of the most demanding work of his career solving a problem that had, until then, never quite needed solving in this particular way. How to build the skeleton for a body no one had ever had reason to build before. What would it have actually meant in practice for a young draftsman to sit down and begin answering a question like that? You picture him at one of those long ruled tables, the plaster studies from Bartholdi's studio, brought in and set beside drawings that had nothing sculptural about them at all. Sections, elevations, the kind of marks an engineer makes when he is trying to see through a surface to whatever has to hold it up. Koechlin's early sketches from this period, the ones that survive in the archive, show something almost startling the first time you look at them. Not a woman at all, but a bare lattice, a tower of iron reaching upward through the empty space where the figure would eventually stand, as though the robe and the face and the raised arm were only a kind of weather that would later gather around a frame already capable of standing on its own without any of it. That was the shift, quiet and enormous, that the Rue de Chazelle brought to a project that had begun as a sculptor's vision. A statue, in the old sense, is solid the whole way through, or as solid as its maker can afford to make it, stone all the way to its center, or bronze cast thick enough to trust its own weight. But nothing built at this scale could be poured or carved that way, and nothing needed to be. What Koechlin was drawing, sheet by sheet, was closer in spirit to the bridges and viaducts the firm already knew how to build than to any statue that had ever stood before it. A central iron mast rising through the whole height of the figure, with a secondary framework branching from it the way ribs branch from a spine, close enough to the copper skin to support it, never so close as to bind rigidly against it, because copper and iron do not move together in the cold the way a sculptor might wish they did. There is no need to hold on to the mechanics of any of that tonight, only the shape of the idea, settling slowly into place on those drafting tables, that the woman the whole world would eventually recognize by her silhouette alone was going to be, underneath everything visible, an iron tower first. And once that idea existed on paper, another question followed almost immediately behind it. one that would occupy the firm for a long while yet. If the skin was never meant to bear its own weight, what exactly was it meant to do instead? And how thin could something be and still hold a shape at all? It had not begun on any drafting table at all. It had begun years earlier, in a much smaller room, with a much smaller woman standing on a much smaller table, made of plaster and about the height of a man's forearm, and a sculptor named Frederick August Bartholdi walking slowly around her, the way you might walk around a piece of furniture you were not yet sure would fit through the door. You can picture that studio easily enough if you let yourself. The smell of wet plaster, cold light through a north-facing window, tools laid out on a bench in the order a careful hand keeps them. Bartholdi had made small studies like this before for smaller commissions, and none of them had ever needed to think about their own skeleton. A statue the size of a garden ornament holds itself up simply by being solid. You do not ask a small bronze figure how it stays standing. It stays standing because there is enough of it, all the way through, and gravity has nothing to argue with. The trouble began the moment Bartholdi decided this particular woman would not be small. He wanted her taller than any standing figure had ever been raised in hammered metal, tall enough to be the first thing you saw from a ship still far out past the throat of the harbor, tall enough that her raised arm would sit higher than the roofs of the city behind her. And here is the part that is easy to miss if you only picture the finished statue glowing green in old photographs. A figure that size cannot simply be the small plaster model scaled up like a photograph enlarged in a frame. Everything about a standing body changes when you make it larger, not gently, but in a way that piles up on itself. Double the height of something solid and its weight multiplies far faster than its strength does. Bartholdi's woman, enlarged past anything a sculptor had tried in copper before, was not a bigger version of a stable idea. She was a new problem entirely, one that had never actually been solved, only assumed to be solvable by people who had not yet tried. And copper itself, the material Bartholdi had settled on for her skin, made the problem sharper rather than softer. The technique he intended to use, hammering thin copper sheet into shape over wooden forms, a method called repoussé, the same one that had given the world delicate decorative panels and thin ornamental figures for centuries, depended on the metal being thin. Thin enough to be worked by hand at all. Thin enough that a single sheet held up to a lamp in the workshop would let a little light bleed through at the edges. You could stand close to one of those finished copper panels later, once she was built, and press your palm flat against her, and feel how little there was between your hand and the empty air on the other side. That thinness was not a compromise Bartholdi made reluctantly. It was the entire point of the technique, the thing that let a sculptor's hand shape a face or a fold of drapery with any tenderness at all. But it also meant that the skin, on its own, had roughly the structural honesty of a rolled sheet of paper standing on its edge. It looked like a woman. It could not, by itself, hold up a woman. So Bartholdi did what any sensible person does when they run into a problem outside their own trade. He went looking for an engineer. The one he found first, and trusted for years, was a well-known architect named Eugène Viollet-le-Duc, already respected across France for his restoration work on old cathedrals, a man who understood stone and mass and the long patient arithmetic of things that have to stand for centuries. Viollet-le-Duc's answer to the problem was, in its way, exactly what you would expect from someone who had spent a career thinking about cathedrals. He proposed building a masonry pier up through the center of the figure, a solid core of brick or stone, rising inside her the way a bell tower rises inside its own walls, with the copper skin fixed to it directly, tied on at intervals like cladding fastened to a chimney. It was not a foolish idea. It was, in fact, the obvious idea, the one that 4,000 years of building in stone had trained every engineer of that century to reach for first. If something needs to stand very tall, you give it a solid spine. There is no need to carry the details of that scheme any further into the night with you, only the shape of what happened to it. For a while, that masonry core was the plan. Drawings were made. Bartholdi worked toward it, trusting a man whose judgment he had every reason to trust. And then, before the pier was ever built, before the question could even be properly tested against the weight it was meant to carry, Viollet-le-Duc died, and the plan he had been carrying in his head, much of it apparently never fully written down in a form anyone else could simply pick up and finish, died along with him in any usable sense. Bartholdi was left holding a half-solved problem and no solver. And even setting his death aside, people closer to the project had already begun to worry, quietly, that a solid masonry pier inside a hollow copper skin brought its own difficulties. Enormous dead weight to carry down through a foundation not yet built, and a rigid stone core sitting inside a thin metal shell that would expand and contract in the heat of a summer afternoon in ways stone never would. A statue standing in full sun for hours does not stay the same size all day. Copper stretches. Stone does not stretch to match it. Something bolted tightly between the two would eventually have nowhere to put that disagreement except into a crack, a tear, a slow, tired failure nobody would notice until it was already happening. You do not need to hold on to any of those mechanics either, not tonight. What matters is only that the first answer to the sculptor's problem had quietly come apart, taking its author with it, and Bartholdi was standing once again in front of his growing plaster woman with no one behind her spine. But if a solid core of masonry could not be trusted to hold her, then what exactly could take its place? Something light enough not to crush its own foundation and flexible enough to move a little without ever seeming to move at all? That question did not stay private for long. Word travels in engineering circles the way it travels anywhere else people share a trade, and the fact that a very tall, hammered copper woman was meant to be built and shipped across an ocean drew the kind of attention that any large, unusual undertaking draws from people who make a living judging such things. Some of that attention came from engineers writing in technical journals, weighing the proportions on paper the way you might weigh a bridge design, and finding themselves unconvinced that thin copper, however cleverly braced, could survive years of Atlantic gales without working itself loose at every seam. Some of it came from newspaper correspondents with no engineering training at all, who simply looked at the drawings, imagined a hollow metal giant standing exposed on an island in open water, and asked, not unreasonably, whether the whole thing might blow over or worse, blow apart slowly from the inside, the way a tin roof works itself free of its nails one storm at a time. None of these critics needed to be cruel about it, and mostly they were not. They were the ordinary caution of an age that had watched plenty of ambitious ironwork fail before it had watched enough of it succeed. You can hear their tone even now in the surviving pages, patient rather than mocking, the tone of men saying simply, "We are not sure this holds." Bartholdi, to his credit, did not treat that skepticism as an insult to be waved away. He treated it as exactly the kind of problem it was, a structural one, requiring a structural answer, not a sculptor's confidence. And so, needing a new engineer and needing one who already had a proven fondness for iron used boldly in shapes people had not quite trusted before, he brought his drawings to the Paris firm of Gustave Eiffel. If your eyes have already begun to close, this is a good, soft place to let them, because nothing that follows tonight needs to be held on too tightly. Eiffel's name, by the time Bartholdi came to him, already carried a certain reputation in French engineering, a builder of iron bridges and iron viaducts across difficult country, a man whose firm had spent years proving, span after span, that iron lattice work could carry loads people once assumed only solid stone could carry, and carry them lightly, with far less material and far less weight bearing down on the ground below. That was precisely the temperament the statue needed. Not another cathedral builder thinking in mass and permanence, but a bridge builder. Someone used to thinking about how a structure moves in the wind, rather than how it simply resists being moved at all. The firm's answer, when it came, was not a pier at all. It was a tower. A slender, open iron framework rising up through the inside of the figure from the base to somewhere near the shoulders, built the way a bridge truss is built, out of individual iron members joined at points rather than a single unbroken mass. It was going to be light, comparatively, lighter by far than any equivalent thickness of stone. It was going to be able to flex very slightly without breaking, the way a tall tree bends a little in a gale rather than snapping the moment the wind arrives. And the copper skin, rather than being bolted rigidly to that iron spine the way Viollet-le-Duc had once imagined bolting it to his masonry, was going to be allowed to move independently of it, connected by a system of flexible ties rather than fixed points, so that the metal skin could breathe with the changing temperature of a day without ever fighting the frame that carried it. None of that had been worked out yet in any real detail. It existed at this stage only as an intention, a direction Eiffel's firm had agreed to take on, a promise that the sculptor's problem now belonged to engineers rather than to hope. The actual arithmetic of it, how many iron members, arranged in what pattern, tied to the skin at exactly how many points, built to withstand exactly how much wind pressing against exactly how much surface area, still had to be done by someone sitting at a drafting table with a pencil and a great deal of patience, turning a good idea into a structure that could actually be built, shipped, and trusted. That work was about to fall to a young engineer inside Eiffel's firm, whose name history would remember far less than Eiffel's own, though the calculations that made the whole thing possible were largely his. But that is a story for the next room in this same building, the next set of drawings unrolled across the next quiet evening, once the tower's rough shape had already been agreed upon, and all that remained was to prove, number by number, that it would hold. The young man's name was Maurice Koechlin, and if you had walked into the drafting room at Eiffel's firm that autumn, you would have found him at a table near the window, the light falling across a sheet already crowded with faint pencil lines, none of them yet certain enough to be traced in ink. He was not the famous partner whose name sat on the letterhead. He was the kind of engineer firms depend on and rarely remember, the one who takes a promising idea and sits with it long enough to find out whether it was actually true. Koechlin had already worked on iron viaducts under Eiffel's direction, had already spent long afternoons proving, span by span, that a lattice of iron bars joined at their ends could carry weight that looked to an untrained eye impossibly far beyond what so little material should manage. A statue was a strange new shape for that same kind of thinking, taller than it was wide, top-heavy in a way no railway bridge ever had to be, and open to wind from every direction at once, rather than just from the side. You do not need to follow the mathematics with him tonight, only the patience of it. The same figure checked, revised, checked again, a pencil worn down slowly over weeks rather than days. Somewhere in that quiet, repetitive labor, the tower Eiffel's firm had promised began, line by careful line, to stop being an intention and start becoming something that could actually be forged, riveted, and shipped across an ocean. Koechlin was the one who carried that pencil most nights, a young engineer barely into his 30s, working at a drafting table set beneath the tall windows of Eiffel's offices on the Rue de Chazelle, where the light came in flat and grey for most of the year and the tables were angled just so to catch whatever there was of it. If you had walked in among those tables in the evening, you would have found the room quieter than you might expect from a workshop building something so large. No hammering yet, no forge heat, just the scratch of pens and the occasional low exchange between two men leaning over the same sheet, checking a dimension against another sheet pinned beside it. Koechlin's task, handed to him almost as a puzzle, was to take Bartholdi's plaster models, the sculptor's careful hand-built studies, each one a little larger than the last, each one already telling him something about how the drapery should fall and where the arm should bend, and turn them into something no sculptor's tools could produce, a skeleton. It helps to sit with that word for a moment before moving past it, because it is doing real work here, not just decoration. A statue built in plaster or bronze in the ordinary way is solid, or nearly so, all the way through. The material itself is the strength. But nothing built at this scale in copper as thin as the sheets Bartholdi had chosen could stand on its own. The skin alone, however carefully hammered and shaped, had no more structural courage than a lantern made of tin. It needed something inside it doing the work of holding it up, the way your own skin does very little of the work of keeping you upright, and your bones do all of it. That comparison was not lost on the engineers of the day, and it is not a bad one to fall asleep to. Skin outside, bone within. the two connected but not the same, each with its own job. Koechlin's answer, worked out across sheet after sheet of drawings that winter, was a central iron pylon, a tower in its own right, rising up through the statue's core from somewhere near the ankles all the way into the torch-bearing arm above. You could think of it, if you wanted a plain picture, as a second, smaller Eiffel Tower folded up inside the first, a tall, four-legged lattice of iron, riveted and braced the same way a bridge pier is braced, wide enough at the base to resist toppling and narrowing as it climbed, exactly the sort of structure the firm already knew how to calculate, because they had spent years calculating things very much like it for railway viaducts across France. That pylon was never meant to touch the copper skin directly. It was meant to stand alone inside the figure, a spine without skin of its own, doing nothing but carrying weight and resisting wind, the two forces that mattered most and that had almost nothing else in common. But a spine by itself does not explain how a shoulder bends, or how a fold of drapery holds its shape against gusts coming off open water, and this is where the second half of Koechlin's design earns its place in the story, a secondary skeleton, much finer and much closer to the surface, built up of iron bars shaped individually to follow the curves Bartholdi had already sculpted in plaster. If you had stood close enough to watch this part of the drawings take shape, you would have seen how different this work looked from the tower drawings beside it, less about straight lines and triangulated bracing, more about tracing a curve on paper and asking what shape of iron bar could hold that exact curve without fighting it. Each of these secondary bars had to be measured, in effect, against a plaster fold that existed only at a fraction of the final size, then reasoned upward, larger and larger, until it matched a piece of copper that did not yet exist. It was patient, unglamorous work, the kind that does not photograph well and rarely gets remembered by name, though on nights like this, it deserves to be sat with a little longer than it usually is. You do not need to hold on to any of these numbers to follow the shape of what they were doing. There is nothing here you need to remember by morning. What matters is simpler than it sounds. A rigid tower in the middle, carrying almost all of the true weight straight down into the foundation, and a lighter, adjustable framework nearer the skin, following its shape rather than forcing it. Between those two systems, and between the fine ironwork and the copper itself, nothing was meant to be bolted tight in the way you might expect if you pictured a skeleton and a skin as a single fused object. That looseness was not an oversight. It was, in fact, the cleverest single decision in the whole design, and it is worth sitting with for a while before the story moves on to where all of that iron would eventually have to stand. But how do you attach a skin of hammered metal to a rigid iron frame without the two simply tearing each other apart the first time the weather changes? That is the question Koechlin's drawings were really trying to answer, underneath all the lines and dimensions, and it turns out to be a question about something you have probably never given much thought to before drifting off tonight: the way metal breathes. Copper, like most metals, expands very slightly when it warms and contracts very slightly when it cools, and a sheet of it left out in a harbour sun through a long summer afternoon, then left again through a cold, salt-heavy winter night, does not stay quite the same size from one season to the next. It is a small movement, nothing you would ever see happen with your own eyes, but it is a real one, repeated every day and every year for as long as the statue stands. If that copper skin had been riveted or bolted directly to a rigid iron frame, skin and bone fused as one, no room between them, every one of those small daily movements would have pulled at the same fixed points again and again, thousands upon thousands of times, until eventually, patiently, something would have to give. Metal fatigue works exactly like that. Not a single dramatic failure, but a very small stress repeated so often that it eventually wins. Koechlin's solution to this, the true elegance of the design, if elegance is even the right word for something so restrained, was to let the copper move. Instead of fixing the skin rigidly to the iron bars beneath it, the secondary framework held the copper in loose iron straps, sometimes called saddles, fitted around the folds of the metal rather than driven through it. The copper could slide very slightly within those fittings as it expanded and contracted, the way a coat sits on a coat hanger rather than being sewn to your shoulders. The bars held their shape. The copper was free to breathe against them. Nothing was locked so tightly that a change in temperature became a fight. This is a strange thing to say about something as apparently solid as a statue standing in a harbor. But it is true. And it has been true for longer than either of us has been alive. The statue you picture as motionless is, in a very small and continuous way, always moving. It is worth resting here for a moment because this idea, flexibility as strength rather than weakness, runs against a kind of instinct most people carry without examining it. The natural assumption, faced with something that has to stand for a very long time under difficult conditions, is to make it as rigid as possible, to bolt everything down tight and trust that stiffness equals durability. Koechlin and Eiffel's office behind him understood something quieter and less obvious. That a structure allowed to move a little in a controlled and deliberate way often outlasts one that is forced to stay perfectly still. You can hear an echo of the same idea in a suspension bridge deck that is allowed to sway gently in wind rather than resisting it outright, or in a tall building today with dampers built into its upper floors, swinging weight to absorb what would otherwise crack a rigid frame. None of those things existed yet in quite the same form when Koechlin was drawing his straps and saddles at that table beneath the high windows, but the same instinct was already there, worked out independently in copper and iron, for a woman meant to stand in open water for longer than anyone drawing her could reasonably expect to live. If you were another young draftsman working in that same office, and there were several, most of whose names the record simply never kept, one of hundreds who bent over tables just like Koechlin's without ever having their contributions singled out, your days would have been filled with this same kind of careful, repetitive checking, comparing a curve on one sheet against a curve on another, making sure a bar meant to hold a fold near the shoulder actually matched the bar meant to hold the same fold 2 drawings later after some small adjustment upstream had rippled through the whole design. It was slow work and quiet work, the sort that leaves no dramatic story behind, only a stack of finished drawings and a faint smell of ink and lamp oil in a room that emptied out a little later each evening as the project went on. There is nothing wrong with letting your attention soften here, the way theirs must have by the end of a long week of this. Some of what made this statue possible was never meant to be exciting, only exact. What makes Koechlin's approach worth returning to again and again as the story continues is that he was not choosing flexibility because rigidity was unavailable to him. Eiffel's firm knew perfectly well how to build something stiff and unyielding. They had done it many times over in bridge trusses that needed to resist exactly that kind of movement. The choice here was deliberate, argued out on paper, weighed against the specific conditions a copper skin in a harbor would face that a steel bridge deck would not, the corrosion that comes from 2 different metals touching directly in salt air, the slow creep of expansion and contraction repeated across decades rather than days, the wind that would come at the figure from every direction at once rather than along a single predictable line the way it does across a river gorge. A rigid connection might have held for a season or a decade, but the whole design was being asked to hold for longer than that. Long enough that no one drawing it that winter could really picture the far end of its working life. Flexibility, chosen carefully and built in on purpose, was the quiet insurance against a future none of them could see clearly, and it turned out, across the following century, to be exactly the right kind of patience to have built into iron. None of this, though, not the pylon, not the straps, not the long nights of checking curves against curves, could rise anywhere until there was solid ground beneath it to rise from. And it is to that ground, half a world away from the drafting tables on the Rue de Chazelle, that the story now has to turn. Before any of Koechlin's iron could be forged, before a single rivet could be driven, someone still had to answer a far older and far less elegant question. What was actually waiting, out in that harbor, beneath the small island the statue had been promised to stand on? Bedloe's Island had never been asked to hold anything like this before. For most of its existence, it had carried nothing heavier than a small, star-shaped fort, its walls sunk into a mix of soil and old fill that no one had ever needed to trust with a tower of iron rising through a copper woman's spine. If you had walked its shoreline in those years before the work began, you would have felt the ground shift slightly underfoot in places, soft where the harbour had once crept further inland, firmer where old masonry from the fort still lay buried beneath the grass. Engineers sent to survey it carried the same patient instinct Kuchlin had carried at his drafting table, the belief that nothing above ground could be trusted until what lay beneath it had been measured, tested, and understood on its own terms. That survey would decide long before any pylon left France whether the island's own bones were strong enough to carry the ones being drawn for her. Bedloe's island itself was a small thing to carry so large a promise. You could walk its shoreline in under an hour, and for most of the century before, it had held nothing grander than a quarantine station, a scattering of graves, and a squat, star-shaped fort built to guard the harbour's mouth against ships that never came. If you had stood at its centre on a clear afternoon before any of this began, you would have seen Manhattan low and hazy across the water, the ferries crossing on their slow diagonal lines, and beneath your feet, grass growing up through the parade ground of a fortress that had outlived its purpose. The island had been chosen less for what it offered than for what it was. A piece of federal ground, already fortified, sitting exactly where a harbour light needed to stand, at the gateway every immigrant ship and returning captain would pass on the way in. Bartholdi himself had picked it years before the statue existed in iron at all, walking its perimeter on an earlier visit to America, imagining where a colossal figure might stand so that her raised arm would be the first and last thing a traveller saw of the country. He was not an engineer, and he did not pretend to be one, but he understood sighting the way a painter understands light, where a thing needed to fall for its meaning to land. It fell to others to ask whether the ground beneath that chosen spot could actually hold what he had imagined standing on it. That was the real question, and it was not a small one. An ordinary building, even a tall one, mostly needs to resist its own weight, to stand there without sinking, without leaning, without settling unevenly into the earth beneath it. A copper figure poised on an island in open water with nothing around her to break the wind was an entirely different kind of problem, and it was the kind of problem that lived in Gustave Eiffel's calculations, long before it lived in anyone's blueprints for the ground. Wind does not simply push against a tall thing the way it pushes against a wall. It leans on it unevenly, gustingly, and the taller and more exposed the structure, the more that leaning becomes a twisting force at the base, a torque in the language engineers use, trying to tip the whole assembly over like a lever. Eiffel's iron skeleton, the one you have already heard rising in outline in the workshops of Paris, would carry that twisting load down through its 4 great iron legs into whatever sat beneath them. And whatever sat beneath them, in this case, could not simply be existing soil. It had to be something built for the purpose, something with enough mass and enough grip on the earth to refuse to move no matter how hard the harbour pushed. You do not have to hold on to any of that too tightly. It is enough to picture it the way the engineers themselves eventually pictured it, not as an ornament sitting on a platform, but as the visible tip of something that reached much further down than anyone walking past it would ever guess. If you had been one of the surveyors sent out to test the island's ground in those early seasons, you would have spent long days driving iron rods and boring rods into the earth at measured points across the old parade ground, listening for the moment the rod struck something firmer, recording the depth at which sand gave way to clay, and clay gave way to something you could trust. The old fort's foundations helped, oddly enough. Fort Wood, as it was known, had been built decades earlier in the shape of an 11-pointed star, its granite walls sunk deep enough to survive cannon fire and a century of harbour weather, and those walls were still down there, solid and unmoved, offering a kind of ready-made ring of strength that the new foundation could be built around rather than dug through from nothing. That was the decision that shaped everything that followed. The pedestal would not simply sit beside the old fort, and it would not replace it. It would rise partly within it, using the star-shaped walls as both a boundary and a kind of buried collar, with a new and far heavier foundation sunk down inside that ring to do the work the old stone alone could never have done. The engineer given charge of that work on the American side, a former army officer named Charles P. Stone, had spent much of his career around fortifications and river defenses, and he approached the pedestal the way a soldier approaches ground. He intends to hold, not with elegance, but with mass. Where Eiffel worked in slender iron members calculated down to fractions of an inch, Stone's foundation would be almost brutally simple, an enormous block of concrete poured directly into the earth inside the fort's old walls, wide enough and deep enough that the wind, however hard it tried, would find nothing to take hold of. But what does it actually take to build something heavy enough to anchor a giant against an open harbor wind on ground that still holds the bones of an old fort inside it? That was the question the next stretch of work had to answer, and answering it meant thinking less like a sculptor's collaborator and more like the builder of a dam. The footing itself, once the excavation was finished, was a square shape sunk into the cleared ground at the heart of the old Star Fort, its sides running roughly the length of a city block if you had folded one into a square, its depth reaching down far enough that a man standing in the finished pit would have had the surface of the island well above his head. Concrete in that era was not delivered in trucks the way it is today. It was mixed by hand and by small steam-powered machines close to the pour, batch after batch. Sand and broken stone and cement turned together and wheeled or hoisted to the forms in a rhythm that never really stopped once it began. If you had stood at the edge of that excavation on one of the long pouring days, you would have felt the ground under your boots carry a low, continuous vibration, and the air would have held that particular mineral, slightly bitter smell that wet cement gives off before it begins to set. A smell that clings to a place for weeks after the work has moved on. Layer went down on layer, each one left to firm before the next was added, because concrete poured too quickly in too great a mass generates its own heat as it cures, and heat unevenly trapped inside a giant block can crack it from within just as surely as any external force ever could. So the work went slowly, by design, week folding into week, the block rising by careful stages rather than all at once. The same patience Koechlin had shown at his drafting table, now expressed in cubic yards of stone and cement rather than lines on paper. There is nothing you need to hold on to in any of that. It is enough to know that somewhere beneath the pedestal that still stands in that harbor today, there is a mass of concrete old enough to have been poured before electric light was common in most American homes, and that it has not moved. Above that buried mass, the visible pedestal began to rise in stone rather than concrete alone, faced in granite quarried in Connecticut and cut to a design drawn by the architect Richard Morris Hunt, a man far better known at the time for the mansions and clubhouses he built for the wealthy of New York than for anything meant to stand alone in open water. Hunt's task was almost the reverse of Eiffel's. Where the Frenchman was hiding an iron skeleton beneath a skin of hammered copper, Hunt was designing a stone skin with nothing hidden beneath it at all, a visible mass meant to look as permanent and as deliberate as the fort whose walls it now enclosed, rising in stepped and panelled tiers that echoed faintly the way a classical temple's base might rise toward its columns. It was not meant to compete with the figure it would carry. It was meant to look as though the harbor itself had simply produced a pedestal worthy of standing beneath her, granite drawn up out of the same ground the fort had always stood on. None of that stonework could rise, however, faster than the money to pay for it arrived, and here the story crosses the ocean in the opposite direction from where it usually travels. In France, the statue's construction had gone forward on public subscriptions gathered through lotteries, entertainments, and small private gifts, coordinated by committees who saw the gift to America as a matter of national pride worth funding steadily. In America, the arrangement had always been understood as a kind of division of labor. France would give the statue and the American people would give her a place to stand. But raising money for a pedestal proved a harder thing to inspire than raising money for a statue, and through much of the early 1880s the work on Bedloe's Island slowed and occasionally stopped altogether for want of funds, the granite tiers sitting half-finished while committees in New York wrote appeals that mostly went unanswered. Wealthy donors who might easily have covered the remaining cost themselves largely declined, unconvinced that a monument standing on an island most of them rarely visited deserved that kind of personal expense. It was a newspaper publisher rather than an engineer or a philanthropist who finally broke that stalemate. Joseph Pulitzer, who had built the New York World into the city's most widely read paper by speaking directly and unpretentiously to readers other publications largely ignored, began printing appeals in his pages, asking not for large donations from the wealthy but for small ones from everyone else. $1, a few cents, whatever a reader could spare, with the promise that every name would be printed in the paper regardless of how little was given. It worked in a way almost no one had predicted. Contributions arrived from children who sent pennies saved from their allowances, from factory workers who gave a portion of a week's wage, from whole schoolrooms that pooled what they had between them until the sum needed to finish the pedestal had been gathered not from a handful of rich men, but from more than 100,000 ordinary contributors, most of whom would never cross the harbor to see what their pennies had helped complete. If your own name had been among them, printed in small type in a column stretching down a newspaper page, you would have been one of a great many strangers who had each decided that a few cents mattered more than doing nothing at all. By the time that funding finally caught up with the stonework, the pedestal on Bedloe's Island had begun to rise in earnest, tier following tier above the buried mass of concrete that had been curing quietly beneath it for longer than most of its granite blocks had even been quarried. If you had sailed past the island in those months, you would have seen it standing incomplete against the sky, a broad stone base with nothing yet upon it, waiting the way a plinth waits before a statue arrives, patient, oversized, faintly strange without the figure it was built to carry. Across the ocean, in a very different kind of yard, the iron and copper that would eventually stand on top of it were only just beginning to take their first real shape, the skeleton still climbing rib by rib inside a building not far from the workshops where Bartholdi had first shaped her in plaster. The harbour had its foundation. The statue, for now, still belonged to France. What that stonework still needed, though, was something to hold on to once the figure herself finally arrived, and this was where Eiffel's work and Hunt's work had to meet in secret, hidden places no visitor would ever see. Deep inside the pedestal's upper courses, iron anchor bars had been set into the granite and concrete long before anyone could have said exactly how the statue's own skeleton would connect to them, a kind of blind trust between two teams working an ocean apart, each building toward a joint neither had yet finalized on paper. You would not have noticed these bars if you had climbed the pedestal's stairs in those months. They sat buried in the stonework, waiting, the way a foundation always waits for the thing it was built to carry. Somewhere across the Atlantic, in that Parisian yard, the answer to how those bars would ever meet the statue above them was only starting to take its iron shape. You would have needed to cross an ocean to find where that iron shape was being decided, and if you had made that crossing in those years, you would have come up through the streets of Paris toward a district that smelled different from the rest of the city long before you reached it. Not the smell of bread or river damp or horse traffic, but something sharper, something metallic, riding low on the air the way wood smoke does in a village at dusk. That smell would have led you, if you followed it, to a yard behind a modest street of workshops, where a woman taller than anything else nearby was beginning to take shape in pieces too large to comprehend all at once. You would have had to crane your neck even from the yard's edge, and you would still have seen only fragments, a curled fold of copper here, the ghost of a hand there, waiting its turn to be joined to an arm that did not yet exist. There is nothing you need to hold on to in this part of the story, no name or measurement to keep for later. Just the sense of a place where raw material was becoming something else, slowly, under hands that had done this kind of work before, though never at this scale, and never for a shape so strange to build. The copper itself had not come from France at all, and if you trace its path backward from that yard, you find yourself following it north, past the Ardennes and into the fjord country, to mines in Norway, where a particular seam of ore produced copper prized across Europe for one quality above all others. It could be beaten thin without splitting. That may sound like a small thing, a detail for smiths and metallurgists to argue over in trade journals, but it was, in fact, the reason the entire statue could exist in the form Bartholdi had drawn it. A copper skin only slightly less forgiving under the hammer would have cracked at every deep fold of the robe, every crease of the face, every knuckle of the raised hand holding the torch aloft. The Norwegian copper had a softness to it, a give that let it be coaxed rather than forced, and coaxing was exactly the method the work demanded. You would not have thought of a hammer as a delicate instrument if you had never watched one used this way, but in that Paris yard, in the hands of the men who did this daily, it was closer to a sculptor's chisel than a blacksmith's tool. Here the story asks a question worth sitting with for a moment, the way you might turn over a stone in your palm before setting it down again. How does anyone shape a single continuous curve of a woman's face, or the great sweep of a sleeve, out of sheet copper thinner than a coin, using nothing but wooden molds and hand tools and patience? The answer is a technique old enough that its name still carries the sound of another century on it, repoussé, meaning roughly pushed back or pushed from behind. It is not a complicated idea to describe, even if it was an exhausting one to practice. Bartholdi's plaster models, already enlarged far beyond life size in stages you have already heard about, were used to cast wooden forms, negative and positive both, hollows and mounds that mirrored every curve of the design. Sheets of copper were laid against these wooden shapes and worked, section by section, with mallets and blunter hand tools, the metal driven gently into the hollow of the mold until it took on the exact contour beneath it. Not struck flat, not forced in one motion, but worked patiently, again and again, the same passage of metal returned to a dozen times, 20 times, until the surface agreed to hold the shape it had been given. You can imagine, if you let yourself, what that yard would have sounded like on an ordinary working morning. Not a single great crash of industry, but something more scattered and more human than that. Many hammers at once, none of them perfectly synchronized, each one following the rhythm of the particular panel its owner was coaxing into shape. Up close, the sound would have been almost conversational, a call and answer of small strikes rather than one continuous roar. If you had stood far enough back at the yard's gate perhaps, all those individual rhythms would have blurred into a single low murmur of metal, steady enough that after an hour you might have stopped noticing it altogether, the way a river's sound disappears from your attention the longer you sit beside it. That murmur is worth carrying with you, even loosely, even if your eyes are already closing, because it was the sound of the statue being born in fragments, panel by separate panel, long before anyone outside that yard had any sense of what the whole would look like assembled. Every one of those panels, once finished, was given a number, stamped or painted somewhere along its edge, an identity it would carry for the rest of its working life. This was not a decorative flourish. There was no way to build a figure this large from pieces this numerous without a system to track which curve of copper belonged beside which, and Bartholdi's workshop kept records the way a careful shipbuilder keeps records of frames and planking, because a mistake discovered only at final assembly, high above the yard, would have cost weeks that nobody had spare to lose. You would have seen those numbers if you had walked close enough to the stacks leaning against the workshop walls. Rows of curved copper sheets standing on end like enormous scales fallen from some even larger creature, each one waiting its turn, each one already assigned its place in a design that existed at that stage mostly on paper and in Bartholdi's own memory of the model he had built. That system of numbered panels leads naturally to a second question, one that had nothing to do with the copper skin at all, and everything to do with what would hold that skin upright once it was finally joined together. A statue this size, made of metal this thin, could no more stand on its own than a dress could stand up empty on a chair. Something had to be built inside it, unseen, that the copper could hang from rather than lean against, and that unseen structure is where the story now has to turn. So where did the iron for that structure come from, and how did anyone decide what shape it needed to take before the skin it would carry even existed in finished form? This is the quieter half of the story, the part that never shows on the outside of the statue and was never meant to. While the copper panels were being coaxed into their curves out in the yard, in the drawing offices nearby, a very different kind of work was underway, governed by numbers rather than by the eye, by calculation rather than by touch. Gustave Eiffel brought into the project once it became clear that Bartholdi's original internal framework would not answer the engineering demands of a standing figure of this height, worked with his colleague Maurice Koechlin on a skeleton of wrought iron meant to do something no sculptor's armature had ever quite been asked to do before: support a flexible metal skin loosely, allowing it to move slightly with wind and heat, rather than binding it rigidly to a fixed frame the way earlier large statues had been built. The iron itself came from French forges, rolled and shaped to careful specifications that Koechlin's drawings dictated bar by bar, no two lengths quite the same, each one cut and worked to fit a particular position within the skeleton rather than pulled from some uniform stock. If you had watched a shipment of that iron arrive at the workshop gate, you would have seen it come in on carts, bars and rods and straps wrapped or simply stacked, the paperwork accompanying each load checked against drawings pinned up somewhere inside, foreman matching delivery to design the way a tailor matches cloth to a pattern before ever touching a pair of shears. There is a kind of romance sometimes attached to the copper skin of this statue, and rightly so, because it is the copper that the world eventually saw and photographed and painted. But the iron arriving quietly on those carts is what let the copper mean anything at all. Without a skeleton built to those exacting tolerances, the skin would have been nothing but a beautiful shell with nothing to hold its shape once gravity and weather began working against it. You would have noticed, moving between the two halves of that yard, how different the two crafts felt in the hand and in the ear. The coppersmiths worked with a softness in their movements, hammers glancing rather than crashing, the metal yielding under repeated gentle persuasion. The iron workers, by contrast, worked with a harder, more insistent rhythm, the ring of metal on metal that carries further and cuts through the air more sharply, a sound with less give in it, more finality to each blow. If you closed your eyes in that yard, and there is no reason not to close them now either, you could probably have told which craft was underway nearby without needing to look, just from the character of the sound reaching you. It is one of the small pleasures of a place like that, the way work announces itself through sound alone, long before you ever see the hands producing it. Koechlin's design called for something close to a tower at the statue's core, a central pylon of iron rising through the figure's body, from which a secondary framework of bars and straps would branch outward toward the copper skin, close enough to support it at intervals but never so close as to bind it rigidly in place. This was the detail that made the statue different from a rigid bronze casting, and different too from what Bartholdi himself might have built if left only to his own instincts as a sculptor rather than guided by an engineer's understanding of stress and movement. A figure standing exposed to harbor winds for generations needed some capacity to flex, ever so slightly rather than resist absolutely, the way a tall tree survives a storm, partly by bending rather than only by strength. You do not need to remember any of the specific angles or measurements involved in that design. They were worked out on paper, refined and argued over inside those drawing offices, long before a single bar of the finished skeleton was set into place. What matters, drifting through this part of the story, is simply the shape of the idea. A skin that could move, held by a frame built precisely to let it. By the time both halves of this work were far enough along, the yard behind that Paris street would have looked like nothing so much as a strange harvest laid out for sorting, copper panels stacked in their curved rows along one wall, numbered and waiting, iron bars and straps gathered along another, cut and shaped to drawings that only Koechlin and a handful of others could read at a glance and see a whole woman standing inside them. Somewhere between those two stacks, in the months ahead, the actual work of joining skin to skeleton would begin, panel by panel, bar by bar, rising slowly above the rooftops of that ordinary street, until people passing below had to stop and tilt their heads back to see how far up the shape had climbed. That rising is where the story is headed next, up out of the yard and into the sky over Rue de Chazelle. But for now it is enough to picture the yard itself. Quiet at the end of a working day, copper and iron waiting side by side in the last of the light, each one useless without the other, each one only weeks away from becoming together something neither material could have been on its own. At day's end, the foreman would walk the length of that yard once more before locking the gate, lantern in hand, checking numbered panels against a ledger the way a shepherd might count a flock before nightfall. It was slow, unremarkable work, the kind that leaves no trace in any painting of the statue's history, and yet without it a single misplaced curve of copper could have meant weeks of searching later, high on a scaffold, for a piece that fit nowhere it was tried. You do not need to picture the ledger itself, only the quiet of that closing hour, the last hammers gone silent, the iron cooling where it had been set aside. Tomorrow the same two rhythms would begin again, copper answering hammer, iron answering saw, and somewhere above the rooftops of that street, a shape was waiting for the day it would finally be allowed to rise. That day came slowly, the way most important days on Rue de Chazelle came. Not with any ceremony, but with a foreman deciding the weather had held long enough, and the timber had dried enough, and the iron had cooled enough, that the next courses could go up. If you had walked that street in the year the scaffold began its climb, you would have noticed it before you noticed anything else about the neighborhood, a lattice of raw timber rising past the rooftops, taller than the chimneys, taller than the church spire 2 streets over, wrapped in a skin of tarpaulin and rope that shifted faintly in whatever wind came off the nearby park. The workshop of Gautier et Sire sat behind ordinary walls, the kind of building you might walk past without a second look if it weren't for what climbed out of its courtyard. Inside, the statue was not being built so much as grown, 1 course of iron and 1 course of copper at a time, in the open air of a glass-roofed yard that let in the grey Parisian light and let out, on quiet mornings, a strange procession of hammer strikes that carried over the rooftops like a second, mechanical kind of bird song. You would have smelled the place before you reached the gate, hot metal, linseed oil, the mineral tang of raw copper sheets stacked in bays, and underneath it all the resinous smell of pine scaffold poles still weeping a little sap in the sun. Workers moved through the yard with the unhurried purpose of men who had done this exact motion 100 times that week already. A coppersmith easing a sheet onto a wooden form, a rigger testing a rope with his whole weight before trusting a man's life to it, an apprentice sweeping curls of shaved iron into a pan as if they were valuable, which in a way they were, since nothing here was wasted that could be melted down and used again. If you stood at the yard's edge and looked straight up, past the first courses of the skirt already fixed in place, you would have seen almost nothing recognizable yet. No face, no torch, no folds of drapery, only a bare iron frame reaching toward the glass roof like the ribs of something not yet given its skin, patient in the way that only very large, very slow things can be patient. The scaffold itself became, without anyone quite intending it, a fixture of the district. Neighbors on Rue de Chazelle and the streets that fed into it grew used to glancing up from their washing or their marketing to see how much higher the timber had climbed since the week before. Children were told by parents who perhaps did not entirely believe it themselves that a giantess was being built behind those walls, 1 piece at a time, and that someday she would sail away across the ocean. From certain upper windows nearby, you could look almost level with the scaffold platforms and watch men no larger than your thumb moving along planks laid across the iron, unhooking a crate of rivets, passing a coil of copper strap hand to hand along a line of workers standing exactly far enough apart that nothing needed to be thrown. It became, for a season or two, something Parisians pointed out to visitors. Not yet a monument, not yet anything with a name that meant much outside the trade, but already a landmark of a peculiar kind, a shape rising over ordinary rooftops that had no ordinary explanation. Bartholdi was there often enough that the workmen came to recognize the particular rhythm of his visits, not the hurried inspection of a patron checking that his money was being spent well, but the slower, circling attention of a man who could not quite leave a single curve alone until he had seen it from every angle the light allowed. He would climb the scaffold in his coat, sometimes staying up among the platforms long enough that the light changed around him, studying the plaster models brought up from the workshop below and comparing them, feature by feature, against the copper sheets already hammered into rough shape. The face gave him the most trouble, by every account that survives, and it is not hard to understand why. A fold of drapery could be adjusted with some tolerance, and no one below would ever know the difference, but a face carries its expression in matters of a few finger widths, and Bartholdi wanted an expression that would read the same from close range on the workshop floor as it would from a passing ship a mile out in a harbour he had not yet seen. He adjusted the set of the brow, the angle of the gaze, the particular calm around the mouth that he wanted read as resolve rather than sternness, and did this work the way a sculptor does it, by touch, by stepping back, by asking someone standing nearby whether it looked right to them, someone who might have been a foreman or a passing apprentice and whose honest answer mattered to him more than you might expect from a man of his growing reputation. Beneath all of this, quietly and without much fuss made over it in the record, Maurice Koechlin's iron skeleton kept rising. Where Bartholdi worked in curves and expressions, Koechlin worked in loads and angles, and the two kinds of attention met at every joint of the structure without either man needing to explain himself much to the other. The central pylon, the spine of the whole figure, went up first, a tower of latticed iron not unlike a smaller cousin of the kind of ironwork that would later make its designers famous on the other side of the city, braced diagonally so that no single strut carried more than its fair share of the weight above it. From that spine, secondary ribs reached outward toward where the copper skin would eventually hang, each one calculated to flex a little rather than resist, because Koechlin understood something that would only become obvious to everyone else once the statue was standing in open weather, that a rigid skeleton married to a rigid skin would eventually tear itself apart, and that the only way to build something this large and this thin was to let its two halves move independently of one another, like a coat that hangs from shoulders rather than one that is glued to the skin beneath it. If your eyes have already begun to grow heavy, none of the numbers in any of this need to stay with you. Only the picture of a courtyard full of quiet, competent work, and a shape rising slowly enough that the neighborhood could watch it happen in the corner of an ordinary week. But how do you hang a skin that must never be allowed to touch its own bones? That is the question the whole build kept circling back to, on the scaffold and in the drafting room alike. And it is worth sitting with for a moment, because the answer is one of the quieter cleverness of the whole undertaking. Copper and iron, pressed directly against one another in the open air, do not simply coexist. Moisture between them turns the whole joint into a weak battery, and one metal begins slowly eating the other, a process no one wanted discovered decades later in the form of crumbling rivets hidden inside a completed monument. So the connection between the copper skin and the iron ribs beneath it was never allowed to be a connection at all in the ordinary sense. Instead, flat iron bars were fixed to the framework, and onto those bars were fastened copper saddles, small fittings shaped to cradle the edge of a copper sheet, the way a hand might cradle something it did not want to grip too tightly. Between the iron and the copper, a layer of cloth soaked in a protective compound was pressed in, thin enough to be invisible once the panel was fixed, thick enough to keep the two metals from ever touching skin to skin. It was a small detail in a project full of very large ones, and yet it is the reason the statue's copper has lasted as long as it has without eating itself hollow from the inside. The saddles themselves were not fixed rigidly to the sheets they held. Each one allowed the copper a small amount of play, a fraction of movement in almost any direction, so that when the metal expanded in summer heat or drew tight in winter cold, it could shift within its fitting rather than fight against it. You might picture it as something closer to a woman wearing a coat sized generously enough to move her arms freely inside it, rather than one stitched tight to her shoulders. The coat hangs from a few fixed points and drapes the rest of the way down by its own weight, never asked to bear a strain it was never built to carry. This was the principle Bartholdi and Koechlin had settled on together after Viollet-le-Duc's earlier plan for a solid interior had been abandoned, and it is the same principle, in essence, that lets any large sheet metal structure survive the ordinary violence of weather, let the skin move, and put the strength somewhere else entirely in a skeleton built to carry it. Watching this being done, if you had been allowed onto the scaffold yourself, would have looked almost unremarkable. a workman lifting a sheet of copper the shape of a fold of drapery or the curve of a knuckle, sliding it into place against the waiting saddles, tapping it gently until it sat where it was meant to, then moving down the row to test the fit of the panel before it. Nothing about the motion looked like it was solving a chemistry problem. It looked, and largely was, like any other trade practiced carefully by people who had grown good at it through repetition. The same coppersmith you might have noticed weeks earlier beating raw sheet over the wooden forms was very likely one of the same hands fitting those finished panels into their saddles now, having followed a single piece of the statue's skin from flat metal to curved form to its place on the rising figure, a continuity of care that no drawing could have specified and that only a patient workshop culture made possible. The seasons went by more than the days did, in the way this story is best remembered. A winter passed with the scaffold standing bare and cold against a grey sky. Work slowing but never quite stopping. Braziers kept burning in corners of the yard so hands wouldn't stiffen too badly to hold a hammer. A spring came with longer light and the courtyard smelling of new sap from replaced scaffold poles, more panels going up in a week than had gone up in a month during the coldest stretch. By the time a second summer had come and gone, the figure had a torso, then shoulders, then the beginning of an arm reaching up past the level of the surrounding rooftops, visible now not just from nearby windows, but from streets several blocks away, a rumor made suddenly, undeniably physical. There is nothing you need to hold on to in any of this, no date worth keeping track of in the dark, only the sense of a very large thing being allowed to take exactly as long as it needed, one season folding into the next, while a woman of iron and copper grew slowly toward a face that was, at last, beginning to look like the one Bartholdi had carried in his mind since a boat ride up a river years before any of this had a name. Somewhere below her, on the workshop floor and up along the scaffold planks, the same hands kept returning day after day, season after season, and it is to those hands, who they were, what they earned, what the work cost them, that the story turns next. Who those hands belonged to was never a single answer. The workshop kept no single ledger that survives whole, but the pay books that do remain show coppersmiths and riggers moving in and out of the yard by the dozen across the build, some staying only a season, others returning year after year as though the statue had become their own private commitment rather than simply a wage. Among them was a young riveter who shows up in the fragments of record more than once, not named in any account that has come down to us, one of hundreds whose names no ledger kept, but present, it seems, from the early courses of the skirt to the final panels of the raised arm, a thread of continuity running quietly beneath the larger names history chose to remember. It is worth pausing on what a day in his life actually looked like, because the courtyard, for all its patience, was not a gentle place to earn a living. A day in his life began long before the light did. You would have heard the courtyard before you saw it, the forges already breathing somewhere behind the workshop walls, a low roar that never quite stopped between the hours of 6 and 6. He would have walked to the yard through streets, still holding the smell of the night's rain, past bakers just opening their shutters, and he would have eaten, standing up if he ate at all before the whistle, bread, perhaps a little coffee if the week had been kind to his pocket, because a riveter's wage, decent as it was compared to a labourer's, still had to stretch across rent and food and the boots that wore through faster than anyone liked to admit on scaffolding like that. You do not need to remember the figures. What matters is the shape of the day. And the shape of the day was heat and height and the particular fatigue that comes from using your whole body to do work that also demands the finest attention of your hands. The riveting itself was a small piece of theatre performed at dangerous elevation, and it required at least 2 men working as one, sometimes 3. A boy, often a boy, sometimes barely more than that, tended a portable forge lashed to the scaffold or set on a platform a level or 2 below, feeding it coke and working the bellows until a rivet glowed the colour the trade called cherry, sometimes brighter, and when it was ready he would seize it with tongs and throw it, up through open air to the men waiting above, who caught it in a metal cup or an iron funnel because bare hands would have ended the day early and badly. You can imagine the sound of that catch, a short metallic ring swallowed almost instantly by the wind moving through the ironwork, and if your eyes were closed, you would know the throw had landed true by that single note and by the fact that no one below was shouting. The rivet went straight from the cup into the hole already drilled and aligned in the plates, glowing still, soft enough to be worked, and then the hammering began. One man holding a heavy iron dolly hard against the head on one side, while another, sometimes two others, drove the opposite end with hand hammers, or with the pneumatic tools that were just beginning to change trades like this one. Blow after blow until the soft orange metal spread and cooled and locked the plates together with a grip that no bolt of the period could equal. A skilled team could work through a great many rivets in a single day, and the sound of it, that particular clattering, ringing, overlapping rhythm of a dozen such teams working at once across the scaffolding, must have carried out over Rue de Chazelle and into the surrounding streets in a way the neighbors either learned to love or learned to hate, depending on their patience for industry at close range. You would have felt the height in your knees before you felt it anywhere else. The scaffolding rose in stages as the copper and iron rose with it, and men who had started the year working at a comfortable distance from the ground found themselves by autumn standing on platforms with the rooftops of the district laid out below them like a map, the plane trees along the boulevards reduced to green smudges, the ironworks of the city's factories sending up their own private columns of smoke in the middle distance. There was no harness in general use for work like this, no netting strung beneath a man's feet in case a plank gave way or a grip failed, and so a great deal of the safety of the operation rested on something harder to measure than any tolerance in Eiffel's drawings: the discipline of the men themselves, their care with each other, their refusal to hurry in a trade where hurrying killed people. The young riveter who threads through the fragments of the record, unnamed as he is, would have learned this discipline early, most likely from an older hand who had learned it from someone older still, because trades like this passed their caution down the same way they pass down the swing of a hammer hand to hand, without much needing to be written anywhere. There were meal breaks, and the record is kind enough to preserve a little of what they looked like, if not who exactly sat where. Men came down from the scaffolding in shifts, rather than all at once, because the work rarely stopped entirely, and they ate in the shade of the workshop sheds or on stacked timber if the weather allowed it, bread and cheese and whatever a wife or a mother had sent along wrapped in cloth, sometimes wine, watered or not, depending on the man and the week. There was camaraderie in it, the particular kind that grows between people who trust each other with their lives every working hour without ever quite saying so aloud. A hammerman and his catcher, a coppersmith and the apprentice who fed his fire, developed a shorthand of gesture and glance that outsiders could watch for an afternoon and never fully decode. You get the sense, reading what survives of the accounts from men who worked sites like this one in that period, that the danger was never spoken of directly and yet was never forgotten either. It sat at the edge of every joke, every complaint about the wind, every quiet check of a rope or a plank before a foot was set on it. If you have ever worked at height yourself, even on something as ordinary as a roof, you will know that particular quality of attention, the way the body simply refuses to relax the way it does at ground level, no matter how used to it you become. There is nothing you need to hold on to here. None of these names, none of these particular mornings. Only the sense of it if you want to keep something as you drift, that a woman rising out of copper and iron over a Paris courtyard was assembled one glowing rivet at a time by men whose whole working lives had trained them for exactly this, and who very likely never once stopped to think of themselves as doing anything remarkable. But heat and hands and courage were only half of what held the structure together, because none of that skill would have mattered without a discipline of an entirely different kind pressing down on the workshop from above. The discipline that came from the drawings themselves and from the man whose name would eventually eclipse almost everyone else's on the project. What was it, exactly, that made working under Gustave Eiffel different from working under any other engineer of the period? And why did his reputation for precision follow him onto this particular job before the statue had even reached its full height? Eiffel had built his name on structures where the margin for error was thinner than tradition allowed, bridges and viaducts where a fraction of a centimeter in one member could translate into a serious problem many meters away, and he carried that same intolerance for looseness into the courtyard on Rue de Chazelle the moment the internal skeleton became his responsibility. The men on the scaffolding would have felt this less as a philosophy and more as a set of habits imposed on their daily work. Templates checked and rechecked before a plate was cut. Holes drilled to a specification that left no room for the old habit of easing a stubborn fit with a heavier hammer. Inspections that came without much warning and did not care how skilled the hand being inspected was. You can imagine the particular irritation and the particular pride that this bred among tradesmen who had spent years learning to trust their own eye and their own feel for metal, and who now found themselves working to tolerances set down on paper by men in a drawing office who had never once climbed the scaffold themselves. And yet the record suggests something closer to respect than resentment took hold, because the discipline paid for itself in a way a working ironworker could recognize immediately. Plates that fit without forcing, joints that held without slipping, a structure that did not fight itself as it rose. That discipline mattered more with every course of copper and iron added, because somewhere behind the courtyard, away from the noise and the forge smoke, Maurice Koechlin's calculations were still very much alive, still being revisited as the real weight of the thing began to replace the estimated weight on his drawings. Every additional section of the skeleton, every sheet of copper hammered into place over the armature, shifted the true load working down through the iron toward the masonry pedestal that did not yet exist across the ocean, and Koechlin's task was to keep checking that shifting reality against the flexibility his design had promised, to confirm, section by section, that the skin could still move independently of the bones beneath it, as temperature and wind acted on a structure larger than almost anything built in that manner before. This was not glamorous work, and it left no dramatic mark on the courtyard the way a glowing rivet or a swinging crane did, but it was every bit as essential. A quiet parallel labor running alongside the noisy one, arithmetic keeping pace with iron. By the time the last sections of the raised arm and the crowned head were fitted into place above the rooftops of the district, the statue had become something genuinely strange to behold from the streets around it. An enormous woman in copper and iron standing among chimney pots and mansard roofs, visible from unexpected angles all over that part of Paris, drawing the eyes of people who had no connection to the project at all. If your eyes are already closing, let that image settle in gently. A colossal figure taking shape not on some symbolic horizon, but in the middle of an ordinary working neighborhood. Scaffolding still clinging to her shoulders, the ordinary life of the city going on in her shadow. She would not stand there for very long. The plan had always called for her to come apart again, panel by panel, rivet by rivet, the very structure that had taken years to raise now waiting to be dismantled piece by piece for a journey across water far wider than the Seine. But before any of that came the question of how you take apart something that was never meant to come apart easily, and the answer, worked out long before the last rivet went in, had been quietly shaping decisions on the scaffolding for months already. Every major seam in the copper skin had been planned as a future joint of disassembly as much as a joint of assembly, which meant the riveters were not simply closing metal against metal forever. They were closing it in a way that a crew with cold chisels and patience could someday open again without ruining the sheets beneath their hands. You would not have noticed this from the ground, and most of the men doing the work likely thought of it, if they thought of it at all, as just another of the drawing office's fussy requirements. One more line on a template that made the job slower than it needed to be. But it meant that the woman going up over that courtyard was, from her very first rivet, already a woman designed to be taken down. There was a rhythm to the seasons on that site that the record keeps a little better than it keeps the names of individual men, and it is worth sitting with for a moment, the way the courtyard would have looked different in January than it did in July. Winter brought short days and cold hands. Coke fires burning longer and hungrier to keep the forges at temperature, breath visible in the gaps between hammer blows, and men working in whatever layers they could afford without losing the dexterity a rivet demanded. Summer brought its own trouble. Copper sheeting almost too hot to touch by mid-afternoon where the sun struck it directly. The smell of hot metal mixing with dust off the street. Water carried up in buckets more for drinking than for any ceremonial reason. A crew learned to read the weather the way a farmer might, not because the statue cared what season it was, but because their own bodies did. And a foreman with any sense adjusted the pace of the day accordingly, pushing hard in the cool hours and easing off when the heat made a slipped grip more likely than it should have been. It was somewhere in this rhythm, across the seasons rather than in any single dramatic afternoon, that the figure finally closed over itself. The last major copper sheets fitted around the shoulders and along the folds of the robe, the skeleton fully clothed in the metal it had been built to carry. There was no single ceremony marking this, no crowd gathered specifically for the moment the skin met itself for the last time, because a project assembled in careful, unglamorous stages rarely ends with a single visible flourish. What came next was quieter and, in its way, more anxious than anything the riveters had faced climbing upward, the business of confirming, plate by plate, that everything fit exactly as it would need to fit again, an ocean away, without the scaffolding, without the forges, without most of the hands that had built it the first time. Before the taking apart could begin, there was a morning when the scaffolding finally came away from her sides for good, and she stood alone in the yard on the Rue de Chazelle with nothing holding her up but herself. You would have had to walk back almost to the far wall of the yard to take her in whole, because up close all you could see was copper, a green-brown wall of it curving away from you in both directions, and it was only from a distance that the wall became a face, a raised arm, a robe falling in stiff verdigris, folds toward a foot you could not see for the buildings in front of it. The workshops around her had never been built to frame a view of anything this size, and so for the length of one autumn, she simply stood there above the rooftops of the 17th arrondissement, visible from streets that had no other reason to look toward that particular block, and people did come to look quietly, the way you might stand at the edge of a field to watch something enormous graze. There was no single ceremony that gathered everyone at once to mark this, no ribbon, no crowd assembled for the express purpose of applause, because a project built in careful stages by men who measured everything to the width of a rivet does not lend itself naturally to spectacle. What happened instead was smaller, and if you had been there, somehow more affecting for being small. French officials came, in their turn, dark coats and tall hats among the workshop soot, to walk the base of her and look up, the way you look up at a cliff and feel your own neck complaining before your mind has finished being impressed. Bartholdi walked with them. By every account that survives, he did not say a great deal on those visits, which was unusual for a man who had spent nearly 2 decades talking other people into believing this was possible, but there is only so much a sculptor needs to say when the thing itself is standing over everyone's head, answering every argument at once. The public came too in smaller numbers, drawn by word passed along the streets rather than by any formal invitation, and you would have found them doing what people always do in front of something too large to hold in one glance. Walking a slow half-circle, stopping, walking again, tipping their heads back until their hats nearly fell. If you had stood among them, you would have felt the particular hush that gathers around finished things. A quiet that has nothing to do with silence because the yard was never actually silent. There were still carts moving, still men calling to each other over some unrelated task at the far end of the workshops. It was a hush inside people rather than around them. She had been a set of drawings, then a plaster model, then a forest of wooden armatures, then years of hammered copper sheets, and now, for a short while, she was simply a shape standing complete against the Paris sky, and everyone who came to see her seemed to be doing the same private arithmetic, trying to reconcile the years they had heard about with the single uninterrupted form now in front of them. You do not need to hold on to any of that too tightly. It is enough to know that she stood, whole for a while, in a city that was not going to be her home, watched by people who would mostly never see her again once she left it, because she was not staying. That had never been the plan, and everyone in the yard that season knew it even as they looked up at her, which gives those weeks a strange double quality if you think about them now, lying in the dark with the rest of this story still ahead of you, a completion that was also, from its very first morning, a countdown. The statue had been built in Paris because that was where the copper could be hammered and the iron could be forged, and Bartholdi and Gustave Eiffel could stand close enough to argue over tolerances in person, but her harbour, the one she had been imagined for from the start, was an ocean away, on an island whose ground you have already heard something about, where a pedestal was rising far more slowly than anyone in Paris would have liked. The completed figure in the yard was, in a sense, only a rehearsal, proof that every plate agreed with its neighbor, that the skeleton inside carried the skin the way it was meant to, that nothing had drifted or warped or been miscut anywhere along the long climb from foot to torch. Once that proof had been taken, in the eyes of the officials and in the quieter, more exacting eyes of Eiffel's own engineers, the next work could begin. And the next work was almost the opposite of everything that had come before it. What does it actually take to undo something that size? Something built with the intention that it would never move again once it stood in its true home? The answer, worked out carefully in the drawing offices before a single bolt was loosened, was patience of a very particular and unglamorous kind. Every plate of copper skin, every rib and strap and bar of the iron skeleton behind it had to come down in an order that was, in effect, the assembly sequence run backward, and it had to come down with a record kept at every step, because there would be no one standing in New York Harbor who remembered, the way the men in this yard remembered, which curve of the robe belonged against which curve of its neighbor. You would have seen, if you had climbed the scaffolding again as it went back up around her sides, not to build this time, but to dismantle. Men working with chalk and stencils as much as with wrenches, marking each piece before it left its place. A system of letters and numbers stamped or painted onto copper that had, until a few weeks earlier, been simply part of a face or a shoulder or a fold of drapery, and was now, suddenly, an item in an inventory. The scale of that inventory is worth sitting with for a moment because it tells you something about what a statue like this actually is, underneath the poetry of it. Not one object but many hundreds of separate, individually numbered pieces, each one unremarkable on its own, each one meaningless without the paperwork that told the men on the other side of the ocean where it belonged. If your eyes have already drifted shut somewhere in the last few minutes, that is exactly the right thing to have happened, because none of this needs to be held onto in any detail, only felt, the way you feel the shape of a room in the dark without needing to see the furniture in it. The young riveter who had climbed with her from the first plates on the framework, one of the many hands whose names the record never troubled to keep, would have known this dismantling as a different kind of labor from the raising, quieter in some ways and heavier in others. Going up, there had been the satisfaction of watching a shape emerge that had not existed the day before. Coming down, there was only the discipline of not making a mistake, because a mistake made now, a wrongly numbered plate or a bar set down in the wrong crate, would not be discovered until a ship's hold had already closed over it, and an ocean lay between the error and any chance of correcting it in the workshop where the drawings still hung on the walls. You can imagine, if you have ever taken apart something you built with your own hands, that particular ache of undoing careful work, not sorrow exactly, but a kind of reluctance in the fingers, a wish that the wrench would turn more slowly. Bartholdi, in his later writing, did not hide the strangeness of that reversal. He had spent the better part of 20 years carrying an image of a standing woman in his mind before a single plate of copper had ever been shaped to match it, and now, only a matter of weeks after finally seeing that image made solid and whole above a Paris street, he had to watch it come apart again, piece by numbered piece, into crates. There was pride in what he wrote about those weeks, because the coming apart was itself proof that the design had worked exactly as intended, built from the beginning to be assembled twice, once here for testing and once more for good across the water. But there was also something close to grief in it, a sculptor's particular grief at seeing a face he had drawn and modeled and finally raised into daylight, reduced again to disassembled parts stacked in a yard, indistinguishable for the moment from ordinary cargo. He had wanted her finished. He had gotten finished for only a season, and then finished had to be taken apart in order to become finished again, somewhere else for good. You would not have needed to know any of that history to feel it, standing at the edge of that yard as the crates began to fill. There is something plain and a little sad in watching a completed thing broken back down into components, whatever the reason. The way a house looks briefly wrong with its furniture half packed into boxes, even when you know perfectly well the boxes are only going somewhere else. But the practical work did not pause to indulge that feeling, and it could not, because an ocean crossing does not wait on anyone's sentiment. Where do you even begin packing something like this for a voyage? You begin, it turns out, with a great deal of wood and a great deal of care about how that wood is used. The larger copper sections, the great curved plates that had made up the drapery, and the face and the raised arm were far too delicate to travel loose against one another the way iron bars might, so each was set into a wooden crate built to its particular shape, cushioned so that the long roll and pitch of an Atlantic crossing would not let one copper edge grind against another for weeks on end. The smaller iron pieces of the interior skeleton, sturdier by nature, could be bundled more plainly, but even they went into crates numbered and cross-referenced against drawings kept in duplicate, one set to travel with the shipment and one set to remain behind, in case the sea took anything the way the sea sometimes does. If you had walked the length of that yard in the final weeks before the loading began, you would have found it transformed from a sculptor's workshop into something closer to a freight depot, crate after wooden crate stacked in rows taller than a man, each one stenciled with the same careful lettering the men had used on the copper itself, so that a stranger unpacking any single crate on the far side of the ocean, with no memory of the yard at all, would still know exactly where its contents belonged. The full scale of that packing job is one of those facts that is easier to feel than to picture cleanly, but it is worth trying, lying there in the dark, to imagine a small forest's worth of crates gathered in one place, holding between them every curve and fold and rivet of a figure that had, only weeks before, stood whole against the sky, getting all of it from that yard to a harbour, and from the harbour onto a ship built to carry the whole disassembled weight of her, was its own long labour of carts and cranes and dock workers, none of whom needed to know what they were loading so much as how heavy it was and which way up it went. And once it was loaded, once the hold had closed over crate after crate of numbered copper and iron, there was nothing left for Bartholdi or Eiffel or the men who had built her to do but wait, the way builders always end up waiting once the work has left their hands. Somewhere on the other side of that ocean, on an island whose foundation had already given this story enough trouble to fill an evening on its own, a pedestal was still rising, more slowly than anyone would have liked, with no statue yet to sit upon it and no certainty from where the workers there stood of exactly when one might arrive. It is to that crossing and to that uncertain wait that the story turns next. Somewhere out past the last headland of France, where the coastline falls away and there is nothing ahead but grey water and a grey sky doing its best to look the same, a ship called the Isère sat low in her berth at Rouen, low enough that if you had walked the quay beside her that morning in the spring of 1885, you would have noticed it before anyone told you why. She was not carrying grain or wine or the ordinary freight of a French naval vessel. She was carrying a woman, though not in any shape a passenger manifest could describe, and the weight of that woman had settled the ship's whole frame downward into the harbour the way a hand settles into a mattress. If you had leaned over the rail and looked down into the hold, you would have seen not a statue but a warehouse of her, crate after crate, stacked and roped and stenciled, 214 of them in all, each one holding some fragment of a face or a hand or a fold of drapery that meant nothing on its own, and everything once it found its place among the rest. There is nothing here you need to hold on to yet. The story is only beginning to put out to sea. The packing itself had taken the better part of a season at the Gautier workshop, and the man who had spent his working life bent over rivet holes in the copper sheets. The young riveter you met among the iron workers on the Rue de Chazelles, older now by the years the whole project had cost him, was one of those who helped carry the last crate down to the wagons. He did not go with her. Almost none of the men who built her did. Bartholdi went, restless as ever, unwilling to trust an ocean crossing to anyone else's watching, but Eiffel stayed behind in Paris with his drawings and his other commissions, his part in the work already finished the moment the iron skeleton had proved it could carry its skin. It is a strange thing, if you have ever built something large yourself, to hand it over at the exact moment it becomes real to everyone else. You spend years knowing a structure only as a problem, and then one day it becomes a public fact, and your part in it quietly ends. Eiffel's ended there, on a dock in Rouen, watching cranes lower crates he had never seen assembled into a hold he would never sail in. The crossing that followed was not an easy one. Ships of that era did not so much conquer the Atlantic as negotiate with it, and the Isare's negotiations, by the account of the men aboard her, were poor ones for much of the way. A storm found her partway across, and it was not a storm that passed politely overhead and left. It sat on the ship for days, rolling her low in the water she was already sitting low in, and there were hours, according to the ship's own log, when her crew genuinely doubted whether they and their cargo would see land again. Picture it, if you can bear to, lying there in the dark with your own eyes already closed. A hold full of copper and iron, 214 crates lashed and relashed by men who could feel, through the soles of their boots, the whole ship complaining under a weight it had not been built to carry in seas like these. If she had gone down, there would have been no statue at all, only a story about one, and a hole in the ocean floor off the American coast where a monument to liberty had briefly rested before disappearing into it. She did not go down. The lashings held. The storm passed, as storms eventually do, even when they do not feel as though they will, and the Isère came out the other side of it low and battered but afloat, with her cargo exactly where it had been packed. What reached New York Harbor at the end of that crossing was, by every account left behind, something closer to a festival than an arrival. Word had gone ahead of her. Telegraphs moved faster than ships even then, and when the Isère finally came in sight of the Narrows in the middle of June, the harbor had already arranged itself to receive her. If you had been standing on any deck in that anchorage that morning, you would have heard it before you understood what you were hearing. Whistles from every vessel that could produce one, a great tangled chorus of steam horns and ship's bells that had nothing coordinated about it and everything joyful, because none of those captains had been told to sound their horns, so they simply could not help themselves. Something like 100 vessels are said to have joined that welcome in one way or another, crowding the water around the French ship the way a crowd gathers around a carriage it has been waiting all morning to see, and the smoke from all that steam hung low over the harbor in a way that must have made the whole scene look, from a distance, like weather rather than celebration. And yet none of the people cheering from those decks that day were cheering for a completed statue. That is worth sitting with a moment, because it is easy, at this distance, to imagine the arrival in New York as the arrival of the Statue of Liberty herself, torch raised, already standing the way she stands in every photograph taken since. She was not standing. She was not even assembled. She was 214 wooden boxes in the hold of a French naval vessel, and what the crowds on the water that day were actually cheering for was closer to a promise than a monument. The physical proof finally arrived on American soil that the French half of the bargain had been kept. The American half of it, the granite pedestal she was meant to stand upon, was still very much unfinished, and that fact was about to become the whole of the next part of this story. Because here is the question worth turning toward now, quietly, the way you might turn your head on the pillow without opening your eyes. If the statue had already crossed an ocean, survived a storm, and arrived to a harbor full of cheering ships, why would anyone in New York have to wait even one more day to see her stand? The answer sat on Bedloe's Island itself, in the shape of a granite pedestal that had been rising, as the story left it a chapter ago, more slowly than anyone connected with the project would have liked. General Charles Pomeroy Stone, the engineer who had wrestled that island's soft ground into something capable of carrying real weight, was still directing work there when the Isère's crates were unloaded onto the New York docks, and by the summer of that year, his pedestal had reached perhaps half its planned height. Bare granite, open scaffolding, a broad square base with nothing yet rising cleanly above it. That was the welcome waiting for a statue that had just crossed an ocean to get there. The crates could not go up onto the island to be assembled because there was, quite literally, nowhere yet for them to stand. They were unloaded instead into storage, first at the depot on the docks and then, once space could be arranged, onto the island itself, where they sat under cover through the rest of that summer and into the autumn, 214 boxes of a nearly finished monument waiting for a country to finish the half of the job it had promised. It is worth understanding if you have not already guessed it, why the pedestal had fallen so far behind. France's half of the arrangement had always been the statue, her copper skin, her iron skeleton, her long, slow rise over the rooftops of the Rue de Chazelle, and that half had been paid for largely through the kind of public subscription that suited a country already fond of grand civic gestures. America's half had always been the pedestal, and pedestals, however necessary, have never inspired quite the same enthusiasm as statues. Committees had been raising money for it since before the statue's arm had even toured the country's fairs and exhibitions. And by the time the Isère reached New York, that fund had stalled badly enough that construction on the granite base had actually stopped for a period. The workers sent home, the site left quiet, for want of enough money in the account to keep paying them. It was a newspaper man, not an engineer, who finally broke that stall loose. Joseph Pulitzer, who had bought the New York World only a few years before and was hungry to make it matter to the city it served, took up the pedestal's unfinished state as a cause for his front page, and did so in a way no committee report ever could have. He printed, day after day, the names of everyone who sent in money for the pedestal fund, no matter how small the sum, a nickel from a child, a dollar from a shopkeeper, small handfuls of coins wrapped in letters from people who had never been asked to give to a monument before and found, once asked, that they wanted to. It is a small human kind of detail to hold on to in the dark. Not a single wealthy patron settling the account with a signature, but tens of thousands of separate small gestures, each one printed with its owner's name in a newspaper column, adding up slowly enough that you could watch the total climb week by week, the way you might watch a tide come in. If your eyes have already drifted shut somewhere in this telling, that is exactly the right moment for them to have done it, because nothing in this part of the story moves any faster than that tide did. By the time the campaign had done its work, enough money had come in to finish what General Stone's men had started, and the granite pedestal on Bedloe's Island began, at last, to climb again toward the height it had been designed to reach. The height at which, eventually, 214 crates of French copper and iron, sitting patiently in storage nearby, would finally have somewhere to go. The young riveter, if he had crossed with the crates rather than staying behind in Paris, might have stood on that island through the last of that summer, watching granite blocks go up course by course the way he had once watched iron ribs rise on the Rue de Chazelle, waiting for the day when the two halves of this long transatlantic bargain, the gift and the base it was meant to stand upon, would finally be ready to meet. That meeting, and the strange business of building a woman upward for the second time in her life, this time on an island rather than in a courtyard behind a Parisian street, is where the story goes next. What that storage actually looked like through the last of that summer and on into the shortening days of autumn was less romantic than the harbour welcome had been. 214 crates do not keep themselves, and Bedloe's Island in those months was less a construction site than a kind of open-air warehouse, watched over by a handful of caretakers whose whole job was to make sure that salt air and curious visitors did the copper no harm before it ever had the chance to stand. You can picture it, if the picture helps you drift rather than wakes you further. Long, low stacks of timber crates under canvas, the damp coming up off the harbour every night and settling onto wood that had already crossed an ocean once and now had nothing to do but wait for granite to catch up with it. Copper does not rust the way iron does, but it is not indifferent to weather either, and there were men paid in those quiet months simply to keep the covers dry and the ropes tight, and to walk the rows after storms the way a shepherd counts a flock. Money kept arriving at Pulitzer's offices faster than anyone building a pedestal had dared hope, and the totals printed each morning in the World became, for a great many New Yorkers who had never once thought about statues before, a small daily ritual of their own, a column to check the way you might check the weather, to see how much closer the tide had come in overnight. General Stone's masons, paid again and working again, pushed the granite upward through the last good weather of the year, course by course, the pedestal's square shoulders finally beginning to rise clear of the scaffolding that had hemmed it in for so long. And somewhere in that steady climb of stone, a new kind of work began to take shape on the island as well. Not the packing this story has already told, but its opposite, the slow business of unpacking, of matching stenciled numbers on 214 boxes to a set of drawings nobody on that island had drawn, and beginning, plate by plate, to raise a woman for the second time in her life. But before any hand on that island could match a stencil to a drawing, the crates first had to survive the ocean between them, and that ocean is where this part of the story properly begins. The French frigate Isère left Rouen in the last weeks of May, low in the water in a way that had nothing to do with cargo and everything to do with what that cargo was. You would have felt it if you had stood on her deck that morning. A ship riding lower than her lines suggested she should, settled deep by a weight distributed with more care than speed, 214 wooden crates lashed and chocked into a hold built for barrels and bale goods, not for the disassembled pieces of a woman 300 feet tall. Some of the crates held plates of copper no thicker than a coin, each one numbered in paint and packed in straw so that a careless dock worker an ocean away would not mistake a fold of drapery for a piece of scrap. Others held ironwork from Eiffel's skeleton, the trusses and saddle bars that would let that copper skin breathe and sway without tearing itself apart, wrapped in tallow and sacking against the salt air that finds its way into everything at sea. If you had gone below and put your hand to the timber of the crates in the dark of that hold, you would have felt the whole ship's motion pass through them in a low groan, wood answering wood, the sound a house makes settling at night, except this house was crossing the Atlantic with a torch inside it. There is nothing you need to carry forward from a manifest like that. It is enough to know that somewhere down in that dark, wrapped and numbered and utterly still, sat a face that had not yet looked at anything, a right arm that had not yet lifted, a set of drapery folds that had spent 2 years in a Paris workshop, taking the exact shape they would keep for the rest of their existence, and were now doing nothing at all but rocking gently in the swell. The crossing itself, by the accounts that survive, was neither swift nor troubled. Weeks of ordinary Atlantic weather, fog some days, following wind on others, the kind of voyage that leaves little for a captain's log beyond position and conditions. That plainness is worth sitting with for a moment. After everything that had gone into shaping her, the plaster models, the carpenter's molds, the hammer strokes raising copper a fraction of an inch at a time, her actual journey to the country that would receive her was almost entirely uneventful, a long, quiet drift westward with nothing to mark it but the turning of days. What waited for her on the far side of that ocean, though, was not uneventful at all, and this is where the story has to double back on itself for a moment, because the statue and her intended home had been keeping very different schedules. While French hands were fitting her final copper sheets into place at the Rue de Chazelle, the pedestal she was meant to stand on had barely cleared its foundations. You have already heard how that foundation was sunk. The old star-shaped fort on Bedloe's Island opened up and filled with concrete until it could carry weight enough to anchor a mountain. What had not yet happened as the Isère loaded her cargo at Rouen was the pedestal itself. Richard Morris Hunt's granite tower, the base meant to lift her another building's height above the water before her own height even began, was still climbing course by course under scaffolding, and it was climbing slowly because the money to pay for it kept running short. This is worth pausing on because it is easy at this distance to imagine the two halves of this monument rising in some kind of matched rhythm, French hands and American hands working toward the same date. They were not. The French had committed from the beginning to building and paying for the statue herself, Bartholdi's copper, Eiffel's iron, the labor of every hammerman on the workshop floor. The Americans had committed to the pedestal, the granite plinth that would give her a place to stand, and it was the Americans who were behind. Committees had raised money in fits and starts for years, benefit exhibitions, an auction of art and manuscripts, a subscription drive that stalled more often than it advanced. By the time the Isère was loading crates in Rouen, the pedestal fund in New York was still short of what the work required, and Hunt's granite tower stood half-finished behind its timber scaffold, waiting on money that had not yet arrived. You could have stood at the base of that unfinished pedestal in the spring of that year and looked straight up through open scaffolding at the sky, because there was, quite literally, nothing yet for the statue to stand on. It is a strange thing to hold both images in your mind at once, and there is no need to hold them tightly. Just let them sit together for a moment the way they sat together in that year, side by side and entirely out of step. A finished woman, riveted, seamed and crated, riding low across an ocean toward a harbor, and in that harbor, an unfinished stump of granite, waiting under scaffolding for a fund that would not close itself. So how did that gap finally close? That is really the question the next part of this story has to answer, because a monument with a finished top and no bottom is not a monument at all. It is simply a very large problem sitting on a dock. The answer, as it turned out, did not come from Washington, and it did not come from the committees of wealthy patrons who had been trying and failing for years to raise the pedestal's cost through galas and exhibitions aimed at people who already had money to spare. It came in the end from a newspaper, and from a great many people who had almost none. You may remember Joseph Pulitzer's name from earlier in this story, when his paper first began pressing New Yorkers to take the pedestal fund seriously as their own responsibility rather than a French problem being handed to them unfinished. By the spring, the crates were crossing the Atlantic. That campaign had been running for months, and it was reaching its final and most urgent stretch. Pulitzer's World ran appeal after appeal on its front pages, printing not just the running total of the fund, but increasingly the names of the people who had sent in whatever they could, a kindergarten class that mailed in coins pooled from its own small allowances, a bricklayer who sent a day's wage, an anonymous donor who gave exactly 60 cents and asked that it be counted anyway. If you leaf through the surviving pages of that paper from those weeks, you find the same pattern again and again. Not large gifts from a handful of wealthy names, but a flood of small ones. $1 here, a quarter there, thousands of contributions that individually would not have paid for a single course of granite, but that together, over the space of a few months, did exactly what years of grander fundraising schemes had failed to do. There is something worth resting on in that if you are still awake enough to take it in, and something to simply let drift past if you are not. The last stretch of money that finished the pedestal beneath the Statue of Liberty came overwhelmingly from people who would never see her up close, who could not afford tickets to the exhibitions being held in her honor, who gave because a newspaper had told them, correctly, that this was as much their harbor as anyone's. The fund crossed its goal that summer, and Hunt's granite tower, freed at last from waiting, climbed the rest of the way to its full height while the Isère was still at sea or newly arrived, the last blocks set not long after the ship that carried the statue's crates had already tied up along the waterfront. And that is exactly what happened, because the two schedules, French construction and American fundraising, very nearly failed to meet at all. The Isère reached New York Harbor that June, and the sight of her arrival, by every account that survives, stopped the harbor for a morning. A flotilla of small boats came out to meet her, whistles sounding from every vessel that had steam enough to blow one, and somewhere in that noise sat 214 crates that had crossed an ocean without incident, about to be unloaded onto a dock beside a pedestal that was, even then, still short of its final height. You would have seen it if you had been standing at the rail of one of those small boats that morning, a woman's face, wrapped and boxed and utterly invisible inside her crate, arriving to a welcome she could not yet see, floating past a granite base that was not yet ready to receive her. What followed was not the raising this story has already promised you, not yet. It was a wait. The crates came off the Isère and went into storage on Bedloe's Island, stacked and covered, numbered plates resting against numbered plates in the open air through a summer and into a winter, while Hunt's tower finished its climb behind its scaffolding a short distance away. Contemporary accounts describe the crates simply sitting, copper sheets that had been shaped by hand in a Paris workshop, waiting out the seasons on an American island, exposed to salt weather, while masons above them set the last granite courses and workers began the long business of matching French drawings to French stencils in preparation for the framework that would finally let her stand. Months passed this way, an entire finished statue lying in pieces at the foot of an almost finished pedestal, two halves of the same idea separated by nothing more than a stretch of unfinished stonework and the slow patience such things require. There is no need to hold on to any of that waiting either. The exact count of weeks, the particular weather of that winter, none of it matters half as much as the simple fact of it. Two things built an ocean apart, on two entirely different timetables, arriving at almost the same clearing in history within a season of each other, close enough to complete one another, and not one day closer. If your eyes have already drifted shut somewhere in that waiting, that is exactly the right place for them to close, because what comes next is a slow raising, plate by plate, of something that had already crossed an ocean lying down. That quiet tension, a finished woman in storage, a finished pedestal rising to meet her, and neither yet touching the other, is where this particular telling of her story comes to rest for tonight. I hope you'll forgive me for leaving her there a little longer than she had to wait herself, resting in her crates at the edge of that harbor, granite climbing patiently beside her in the dark. If you drifted off somewhere back around that ocean crossing or somewhere in Pulitzer's small coins and quarters, you haven't missed anything you needed to hold on to. This was always a story meant to be heard the way sleep takes it, in pieces, out of order, mostly forgotten by morning. Thank you for spending this stretch of the night with an old engineer and a woman made of copper and iron. If you'd like another structure to fall asleep to another night, you know where to find me. For now, rest well and let the harbor go quiet. And yet the harbor was not quite finished with her. Not that year. Somewhere in the weeks that followed, workmen did come down to the stacked crates with crowbars and lantern light, and the first sheets of copper began to leave their straw for the last time, though that unwrapping belongs to a night still ahead of this one, not to the one closing now. For tonight, only the picture matters, and it is a simple one. Canvas tarpaulins beaded with harbor damp, a granite tower catching the last pale light of a winter afternoon, and somewhere beneath both, a stillness that had crossed an entire ocean only to find more waiting on the other side of it. If your eyes are already closed, you will not have heard this last part, and that is no loss at all. Sleep does not keep an inventory, and it was never asking you to remember the crates, or the whistles on the water, or the newspaper presses running late into the night for want of quarters. It only asks that you let the noise of all of it go now, gently, the way a ship's timber goes quiet once the cargo is finally carried off, and rest in the same stillness she was still waiting in.